Hello, ENIGMA-U students. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Emily Vanderbleek, and I am a clinical neuropsychologist at the James A. Haley VA in Tampa, Florida. I'll be talking about executive functions and behavior today. So first, I'll describe the areas of the brain involved in executive functioning broadly. We'll talk primarily about three major circuits that go between the frontal lobes and the subcortical areas of the brain. We'll discuss how executive functions impact our behavior. Then we'll also talk about executive dysfunction and what that looks like, and what the role of neuropsychology is in assessing that. So what is executive functioning? As you may have heard in some of the other lectures, this is really an umbrella term that encompasses many factors and higher level cognitive processes. So we often talk about it in metaphor, and I do this especially when I'm explaining it to my patients. So if you think about an orchestra, each of the members have to practice their own parts. They also need to play in harmony with their section and then with the other sections in order to play a symphony. Beyond that, there's the conductor who's in charge of leading the orchestra. So the conductor has to coordinate everything. So they tell the different players when to play, when to increase or decrease their volume. They make sure everyone is in tune and on time. So that conductor is basically our executive functions. So the idea is that executive functions are the control and the coordination of these multiple cognitive processes that are necessary for engaging in goal-directed and future-oriented behavior. The psychologists Don Norman and Tim Challis outlined 5 types of situations in which humans need to activate their executive functions. So first, situations that involve planning or decision making. So you may need to be considering what actions to take to accomplish a goal, what the potential benefits and risks of those actions may be, and then what steps you need to take to actually carry out those actions. Situations that involve error correction or troubleshooting. So you need to both recognize your error and then determine how to adjust. Situations where responses are not well rehearsed or contain novel sequences of actions. So rather than something that's routine, adapting to new conditions, processing new information, and utilizing it appropriately. In dangerous or technically difficult situations, where you may need to focus on specific pieces of information, ignore others, and quickly problem solve. And then situations that require overcoming a strong habitual response or resisting temptation. The frontal lobes, and especially the prefrontal cortex, right up here, are essential for executive functioning. We cannot talk about executive functioning without focusing on the frontal lobes. So the frontal lobe is the largest of the lobes of the brain. It covers about 1/3 of the cortex. It's also the last of the lobes to develop in humans. Development and maturing of the frontal lobes occurs primarily during adolescence, and they're usually fully developed around age 25. So that's when you see those executive functions really fully develop. There are several major divisions of the frontal lobe. So you can see the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and the supplementary motor area here are all involved with planning and executing movements. The frontal eye fields here involved with movement of the eyes. Broca's area here in the dominant hemisphere is involved with language output. We won't really talk about those today. we're going to focus on the three circuits originating in the prefrontal cortex here. It is not only the frontal lobes, but several specific circuits between those regions and the subcortical regions that are really responsible. So each of these three major circuits, the dorsolateral prefrontal, the medial or mesial frontal, and the orbital frontal circuits, originate in the prefrontal cortex. They then project through subcortical areas to the thalamus, which is essentially the relay center of the brain, and then back to the frontal lobes. Even though these circuits do share common structures, they are still anatomically separated. In somebody with executive dysfunction, we commonly think of this as being related to frontal lobe damage, and that is often true, but it can occur if there's damage at any point along these circuits. So we're going to start with the circuit that includes the orbital frontal cortex. This is part of the prefrontal cortex, and it gets its name from its position immediately above the orbits, where the eyes are located. So what does it do? Well, broadly, the orbital frontal circuit is responsible for regulating actions that are triggered by our drives and our appetites. So determining the right time and the right place for behavioral responses. Very important for appropriate social behavior. Using internal stimuli to guide behavior. Inhibiting responses. It's also connected very heavily with the limbic system, so it plays a big role in emotion regulation. It's also involved in emotional appraisal, which means basically assigning an emotional value to a stimulus. So something could elicit a positive or a negative emotional response, and the strength of response also differs depending on what is happening. So we don't react the same way to everything that's in front of us. When you have dysfunction of the orbital frontal circuit, you can see quite a range of behaviors, and these are often very bothersome to other people who are interacting with the patient. So you can see poor decision-making ability, irresponsibility, and poor judgment, which could have some consequences financially, interpersonally, in somebody's job, pretty much anywhere. Poor social skills, so that could be inappropriate joking or inappropriate silliness, inappropriate sexual comments or behavior, or generally just lacking social tact, not responding to those cues. Disinhibition and emotional lability, which are very core features of orbital frontal dysfunction. Aggressiveness, a lack of empathy, reduced self-awareness, and then utilization and stimulus-bound behaviors. So a utilization behavior refers to an inability to suppress the urge to use an object. So they might use the object in a correct way, but in an inappropriate context. So for example, if they see your pen in front of them, they might grab it and just start writing. So it's an appropriate behavior, but at an inappropriate time because they can't resist using that object. If somebody is stimulus bound, that means they're attracted to each new stimulus and they're unable to ignore things that are not relevant to the current task. So they're driven by the most salient feature of the environment, very externally rather than internally bound. So how do you assess orbital frontal dysfunction? Well, you can get quite a lot of this data through your behavioral observations on testing. So is the person impulsive? Are they starting tasks before you tell them to? Are they making impulsive mistakes on the testing? Are they making inappropriate comments or comments that are not relevant to what you're doing? How is their frustration tolerance if they are having trouble with a task? You also get a lot of information from other people. Now, these patients may have poor self-awareness and insight, so a lot of the distress that you see might come from somebody around them rather than what the patient is reporting. A go, no-go task requires that you press a button or tap your hand in response to a certain stimulus. But then when another stimulus appears, you should not respond. So it's looking at your ability to inhibit your response. On a stop signal task, you would show a go signal on all trials. But then on a minority, just as they're about to respond, you would either play a sound or show a signal that indicates they should not press the button on that trial. A delay of gratification task is not really something you would do in an evaluation, but it's still good to mention because it's one of the classic ways of measuring executive functioning. So this involves putting a snack or something desirable before young children. Classically, it would be marshmallows or cookies. And then you ask that they wait before taking it. If they're able to wait, then they can have more of the treat. If they can't wait, then they get less. And this is shown to predict academic performance in young children. The Iowa gambling task, people are presented with 4 virtual decks of cards. Each deck holds cards that will either reward or penalize them with in-game money, but they're not told that the decks differ from each other in the balance of reward versus penalty cards. Some decks are bad decks, which have larger rewards, but also larger or more frequent penalties that outweigh the higher rewards they give. Choosing the decks with smaller rewards will give better long-term payout. Most people will eventually be able to identify the good decks and choose them reliably. But with orbital frontal dysfunction, people will continue choosing the bad decks, even though they might actually know that they're losing money overall. Some of the associated conditions where you would see this type of dysfunction include traumatic brain injury, frontotemporal dementia, Huntington's disease, which is actually from dysfunction of the subcortical areas in that circuit, tumors and stroke, and substance use. Next, we'll talk about the medial prefrontal cortex, or mesial frontal, and that just means in the middle. This is also sometimes called the anterior cingulate circuit, which is referencing the cingulate gyrus right here, which is one of its major structures. This circuit is responsible for detecting errors and self-monitoring, initiating behavior, motivation, and that internal drive, and then sustaining complex tasks and persisting with them. So dysfunction of this circuit is sometimes called pseudo-depression because from the outside, the individual may appear very depressed, but this is not necessarily a mood that they are experiencing or reporting. But you will see a lack of self-initiated motivation and action, reduced emotional expression, impaired initiation of movement, moving very slowly, limited spontaneous speech and reduced social activity, so the person may appear very withdrawn, indifference to pain, thirst, hunger, or other internal drives, poor error monitoring, so not recognizing errors and not correcting them, difficulty with resolving stimulus conflict, So what that means is that the person has trouble when they're getting incongruous information. So cognitively, you need to focus your attention on task relevant aspects of a stimulus and ignore things that are not relevant, even if they're conflicting. If this is overactive, it's associated with obsessive and compulsive behaviors. So apathy is what you can see with more minor dysfunction in this circuit. Abulia is a more severe version of that. And akinetic mutism is the most severe reflection of damage to this circuit. And you typically need bilateral damage to get this. This is characterized by very profound apathy, a lack of spontaneous movement, absent verbalization, not responding to commands. So the person is really not responding to anything at all or initiating any behaviors. This is another one where your behavioral observations during testing are going to be very important. So is the person needing a lot of cueing to engage in the tasks? Are they persisting or are they discontinuing early? Are they making spontaneous conversation with you? Emotionally, are they expressive or do they seem like they have more restricted affect? Collateral interviews as well, or scales, can give you an idea of apathy in those behaviors. The Stroop test, which I have an example of right here, is a test where you show written color names that are different from the color of the ink they're printed in. You're supposed to say the color of the ink and ignore the word that is written. So this is an example of resolving stimulus conflict. So the automatic tendency is to focus on the printed word because reading is something that we do so frequently. But this conflicts with the task instructions. So you need to focus only on the aspects of this stimulus that are relevant to your task. Individuals with mesial frontal dysfunction have a lot of trouble attending to that task-relevant information. You can see this type of dysfunction with a stroke, especially in the thalamus. Vascular dementia, Alzheimer's disease, apathy is one of the most common behavioral manifestations of this. Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia. Lastly, we'll talk about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this circuit is responsible for most of the functions that we think of when we say executive functioning. So a lot of those higher level cognitive processes. This one has the least direct control on social behavior and emotions. This circuit is responsible for focusing and sustaining attention, planning, organizing, and goal setting based on external cues, switching between tasks, adapting to new situations, and then using external feedback to change behavior. So as I mentioned, this circuit is quite cognitive. So when you have dysfunction, you see difficulty with set shifting. You might have impersistence, perseveration, mental rigidity or inflexibility, poor planning, organization, problem solving, decreased working memory, concrete thinking, difficulties with memory retrieval, and then you can see the utilization behaviors and stimulus behaviors with dysfunction of this circuit as well. I'm also going to briefly talk about the cerebellum. The cerebellum means little brain. It's right back here. So historically, the cerebellum has been thought of as being involved with motor learning, coordination, balance, dexterity, but it's also highly interconnected with the frontal lobes. And more recently, there's a lot of evidence that the cerebellum is involved with our executive functions, including working memory, multitasking, inhibition, and emotion regulation. Examining patients with cerebellar damage, researchers have identified a pattern of executive dysfunction that includes cognitive impairment and personality changes, known as cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. So you see a constellation of deficits in executive functioning, as well as spatial cognition, language production, and affect and personality changes. This can be quite broad, including blunting of affect, disinhibition and hyperactivity, appearing almost like mania, ritualistic stereotype behaviors, lack of empathy, depression, childlike behaviors. Now that we've talked so much about executive functions and behavior, you can really see how important these are for functioning in various aspects of life. So, in terms of mental health, you see this executive dysfunction in a lot of disorders, including substance use, anxiety, conduct disorder, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and schizophrenia. It's also associated with physical health problems, so obesity, overeating, substance abuse, and poor treatment adherence. In terms of academic performance, there's a number of neurodevelopmental disorders that are associated with executive dysfunction. So with ADHD, you might see a bit more of the hyperactivity, organization difficulties, trouble with emotion regulation. Autism, you might see more difficulty with social cues or more of those stereotyped behaviors. Executive functioning has also shown to be even more important for school readiness than IQ or reading or math skills, and it predicts competence throughout the school years. Executive dysfunction is also associated with poor job productivity, difficulty finding and keeping a job. It's associated with marital discord and social problems, including crime, reckless impulsive behavior, violence, and emotional outbursts. So thank you so much for listening to this lecture and for participating in ENIGMA-U. I'm very excited to be a part of it, and I hope you learned a lot from this talk.